So this happened a lot sooner than I thought, and that's because initially I was playing Tiny Tina's Wonderland, but I took a break. I'd probably say maybe a third of the way through the game to play Final Fantasy 16. And there's two reasons for that. One, Final Fantasy 16 came out, and two, I wasn't having fun with Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. But I am a fan of the franchise. I've got my Claptrap figurine here. I've got the Marcus bobblehead. I've got collector's edition strategy guides, all the Game of the Year editions, and I even have the next level edition of Tiny Tina's. But with that being said, I couldn't figure out why I wasn't enjoying it. And then it hit me. Let's go discuss. So why didn't I like Tiny Tina's Wonderland at first? Honestly, I didn't know. So I continued to play it until I finally realized it just felt a little too different. Now, I know it is a spin-off, and it kind of takes place within the Bunkers and Badasses world, but we already had a taste of that with Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon's Keep. And honestly, that to me was a little more fun than this, but I think that is only because that was built around Borderlands 2. This is its own thing. So you have to kind of decouple those two things, and I'm going to get into that. But, like always, this is going to be broken down into mainly two parts. It's going to be narrative, which there's not a whole lot, so don't expect that part to be relatively long, and gameplay, and that's going to be a little bit more in-depth. So let's start with the basics on what you should need to know about Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. First, I do want to mention that this game was developed and released during the pandemic, and there were other things that were released then as well. You had Destiny 2's expansion Beyond Light, you had World of Warcraft's but their expansion Shadowlands, and probably a couple others that I'm forgetting. Okay, we're still recording. Good. Just had to check to make sure it was recording. Oops. I'll put this all out. With that being said, it's a complete game. It does have 4 DLCs, but for the most part, it was bug-free, and I didn't really have any issues playing it. No crashes. I think maybe a spot of slowdown here or there, but that was when a lot of stuff was happening on screen. There was one bug that I did face. So, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I took a break from playing Tiny Tina's Wonderland to play Final Fantasy 16. When I came back to Tiny Tina's, I reinstalled the game. I didn't start on a fresh character. What I did instead was just boot up the save that I already had. Why go through all the trouble of rolling a new character, doing all of this, when I had a character already? Upon doing that, I encountered a bug that if I hadn't looked it up, I would have scrapped my character and had to have redone everything. This bug has been in the game, it seems like since launch. I'm surprised it hasn't been fixed yet. It's very clear now that they made Tiny Tina's, they released the DLC, and they've pretty much moved on. The reason why I say that is when Borderlands 2 and 3 got released, we had, and this could be something I'm not seeing, so feel free to correct me, but in all 3 games mentioned, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, Borderlands 3, even the pre-sequel, and Borderlands 2, we had the golden chest in the main hub zone. And through the game's lifespan, Gearbox and Randy Pitchford and the Borderlands Twitter, they would tweet out codes that would give you golden keys to open the chest to get a chance at legendaries and, rares and all that stuff. Unique guns, so to speak. But I didn't see any of that for Tiny Tina's. In fact, there's a gold chest. I don't have a single key, and I don't know how to get a key. I'm sure if you probably got the highest level edition, I got the next level edition, and it came with 2 packs, the Dragon Lords pack and the Golden Armor pack, essentially. And Now that I think about it, I don't remember if I've actually seen anything from the Dragon Pack. I have to double check that I installed that onto the game when I installed the game, but that's for another time. So it seems like to me, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that Gearbox kind of released the game. They dropped the four DLPs. They dropped the four DLCs with the season pass, and they're off working on their next project, which is presumably Borderlands 4. So the bug was I logged in and all of my gear was gone. My character was there, all my skill points were allocated, but all my guns were gone, my shields, my accessories, everything in my inventory had just vanished. So I looked up online, and the only thing I found that worked was I immediately, before quitting the game and before going to a different zone, restarted my PS5. Logged back in, everything was there. So I would warn you, if you are thinking of picking this game up, that is a bug that you could encounter. I don't know how likely it is you'll encounter it, but I encountered it, and it would have been really bad if I had to scrap my character, who I think was level 25, almost level 30 at the time, and start again. Because that's halfway to level cap. Level cap's only level 40. I don't know if the DLCs increase that, but I'll get into that when we get into gameplay. So what's the story? The story is Tiny Tina, Valentine, and Fret the Robot are all in a ship that essentially broke down, and they're just playing bunkers and badasses. It should be noted that this game has a pretty star-studded cast compared to the other Borderlands games. Ashley Birch comes back to play Tiny Tina, and she does a great job like always. And then you have Andy Samberg as Valentine, you have Wanda Sykes as Fret the Robot, and you have Will Arnett as the game's main antagonist, the Dragon Lord. I was playing it next to my wife, and I said, "Who does that sound like?" And she stopped, listened to dialogue, and she went, "Is that Andy Samberg?" And I said, "Yup, they're just here." And also, I should mention this because this is the voice that I used for my player character, the great Christopher Sabat, Mr. All Might himself, amongst other various roles. So the premise of the game is the ship is basically broken down, and instead of fixing it, Valentine and Fret and the newbie, which is your player character, sit down with Tina to play a round of bunkers and badasses. And the reason why you're called newbie, even though I'm pretty sure you can name your character, is because you're new to the game. You've never really played it before. So the game opens up with you all attacking the Dragon Lord. And after that encounter concludes, you are basically sent back to zero, to square one. You make your character's name, you design what they look like, you give them a voice, and you pick their class. Keep that in mind. That's important because it's very different from how other classes work in Borderlands. I'll get to that later. Now, the plot of the game is you essentially play bunkers and badasses, which is the Borderlands equivalent of Dungeons and Dragons. You go from zone to zone, you help people, you adventure, you collect loot, all in an end goal to stop the Dragon Lord, save Queen Butt Stallion and her kingdom. And that's that. There is... I don't know if I'd call it an overarching plot, but as you progress through the game, things start to come out. So it's clear that this game takes place before Borderlands 3. Now, I don't know if Gearbox has confirmed that this is part of the overarching canon, but Tina's design is her younger design instead of her Borderlands 3 design. She's still got the bunny ears on her head. She's got a witch's hat. She's still in her apron, like her smock from Borderlands 2. And throughout the game, you'll hear dialogue from the people you're playing with. So you'll hear dialogue from the Bunkers and Badasses characters as you accept quests and stuff, but every now and then you'll hear dialogue from the people around the table with you. And there are some moments where Tina has dialogue, and you can kind of see that she has this subplot of she's afraid of being alone, she's afraid of people not playing with her, not liking her. What I would love to know, and if someone can find this out and have it confirmed by Gearbox, please let me know in the comments, is I would love to know if this takes place post Borderlands 2. It seems like it. I don't want to say definitely, because if you pay attention, there are lore pickups in the game that are narrated by someone known as the Note Taker, and if you pay attention, the Note Taker's voice is very familiar if you're a fan of the franchise. And there's a scene at the end of the game after you beat the Dragon Lord, which, spoiler, you're gonna fight the Dragon Lord, you're gonna beat him. There is a scene that kind of connects her whole story, and you have this moment of, oh, that's who that is. Oh, this makes sense. Oh, this is kind of neat. And this is my thing with the narrative. As I was playing the game, I was like, oh, okay. It's, it's just it's a spin-off game. I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons, whatever. But as I got towards the end, it was very clear that they were also telling a story in the background. And that story does get wrapped up. My only problem with it, and I don't know if anybody else has talked about it, my only problem with it is that this story, it's very similar to her story in Assault on Dragon's Keep. Not identical, but very similar. That's why I'm led to believe this takes place between 2 and 3 at some point, because of how young she is. But I don't know how. And I could be wrong, but it doesn't make sense because we know Tina's in the canyon for basically the entirety of Borderlands 2 until she makes her way to Sanctuary. But that's just that. I will say there's not a whole lot with these characters. Valentine's kind of this dumb guy who tries to be cool. I will say this, Andy, the voice acting is very good in this game. They really give depth to the characters where I don't think the writing does, but the delivery of the lines do. Andy Samberg, he wants to be the hero of the game. He wants to be the good guy. He wants to be recognized as a knight of the realm. Fret, she just wants loot. It's very stereotypical with certain tabletop game players and even Borderlands players, right? Like, my friends were all about guns. I was there for the story, and my friends were, in Borderlands 2, they were like, hey, duel me, we're going to duplicate this gun because it's better than mine and I want it, which is besides the point. But she's the very punch it, except for certain side quests where the roles kind of flip, and she takes the more, well, I don't want to do the mean thing. Which there's no choice in this game. Honestly, there's no morality, there's no choices, there's no repercussions. It's a very linear game. Which all the Borderlands are, to be fair. But this one is very... The way the game is set up, you could miss a lot of side quests and just go beat to beat to beat to beat. And in that, it could be a very fast game. I also think this game is a lot better with friends, but we'll get there in just a moment. Basically, that's the entire plot. You go through all the characters, you pick up lore for the world of Bunkers and Badasses. In fact, there's a really funny fourth wall breaking history scroll you pick up where the narrator says, it is clear that our world happens in seasons with events repeating themselves. So the Bunkers and Badasses game world canonically is like, oh, this is the Dragon Lord's back again. This is stuff that happens. Overall, it's not terrible. Because it's a spin-off, there's no high expectations, and I reminded myself that when the credits rolled, I sat there and said to myself, this is a spin-off. I wasn't expecting it to lead into another game. This is meant to just be a fun thing for those who liked Assault on Dragon's Keep, which it is. And that's where the gameplay comes in. So, after your initial encounter, you make your character, you pick a name, you pick a voice, body type, skin, and I will say this, the customization in this game is probably the most in-depth across all the Borderlands games. And rightfully so. You're essentially playing Dungeons and Dragons. You could be a lizard person, you could be a giant person, you could be essentially anything you want. So you pick your character and you pick your class. The classes work both similarly, I can't speak, and different to previous Borderlands games. So they work in the same regard where you have a skill tree that you work down towards, but it's only one skill tree. You're not going to have 3 skill trees that you can kind of pick and match like back in the day. You have one skill tree and each class has a unique ability. You have the Stabomancer, you have the Spore Warden. Some of the names I don't remember. I apologize because I only picked the Mage class, which I believe is... Do they just call him the Spellcaster? Spellslinger? I'll put it in the pinned comment what class I picked. But you go through the game, you play as this one class, and you have unique abilities tied to that class. So my character's class, his main ultimate ability was I could polymorph enemies into these sheep that just kind of float around and deal critical damage and kill them, basically making them a non-threat. I also had another ultimate ability which I could pick instead, which lets me slot 2 spells. So where I would have polymorph, I also had the ability where I could, say, have a cast firebolt spell and a freeze spell instead of polymorphing. And a lot of this skill tree is tied to kill skills. The more spells you cast, you'll gain stacks of spell weaving. Spellweaver, now that I think about it, may be the class name, but that'll increase your gun damage, your reload speed, things of that nature. So as you play the game, you're playing as this one class, you're learning points in this one thing, and about probably, I'd say halfway through, you gain the ability to essentially dual spec. So you could be the spell casting rogue. You could be the wizard that also deals in death magic. You could be the big hammer swinging Thor that also, I don't know, is a druid, something like that. It allows you to do that, and you'll get 2 skill trees. What I did notice is you do not get enough skill points to hit the bottom of both skill trees. Where in previous Borderlands games, you could go all the way down one tree, hit the really coveted skill at the bottom, and then get probably about halfway through the other tree. I'm sure you can do that in this one. I just noticed, particularly for the Spellweaver, I didn't want to do that because alongside your class abilities and your class skill trees, you also have hero abilities, because in this game, you are the Fate Maker. And the hero points are basically your D&D sheet. Strength, dexterity, wisdom. There's no charisma, but it's those things. And each of those affect different things. I would say these are kind of like badass points and ranks from previous games. But when you hit level cap in this game, there is essentially a badass system where you have this 4-quadrant grid, each with multiple slots you can put points into. The only caveat is you can only put 1 point in each quadrant in a clockwork motion. So, say it's, I believe, I'm trying to remember, it's like Druid, Spellweaver, Stabomancer, and then like Brute, or something to that regard. So, when you put a point into Druid, you can't put another point in that section. Even if there's something you want, you have to go all the way back around, and you can't skip, I don't believe. I think you have to put a point into each quadrant until you get back up to the Druid quadrant to put a remaining point. And these are the badass points. These affect things like status effect, reload speed, gun damage, loot luck, those kinds of things. But back to the hero sheet is when you pick your class, you are given a set of parameters. Think of it like D&D or a Fallout game. So you have 16 out of 30 Constitution, and that determines your maximum health. And as you level up, you gain your skill points to slot, and you gain hero points. And you can put a hero point into one of these things, and it'll make the number go up by a percentile. That's about it character-wise. As with previous games, you will find more cosmetics and things in the world. I will say, while the initial character customization is very in-depth, you can also change all that on the fly as you go to a... It's not a new you station. It might be. I forget what they call it in this one. But you can also change the paint on your costume. You can do it in different levels. So there's a good depth of customization there. There's emotes, and there's a banner, which you can design based off of preset options, which then gets hung in the hub town. You can also make a statue of yourself, which will then appear in the hub town. So there's good customization, and I guess it would be cool. I don't know if it works this way, but in my head, what would be cool is, say you and I are playing, if I were to join your game and I go to your hub city, it's your statue and it's your banner. Where vice versa, if you were to come into my game, you would see my stuff. I don't know if it works that way. If somebody does, please let me know down below. So that's character customization and skill points and all that fun stuff. The core gameplay is what it has been for years, which is gunplay. But the gun's kind of hit or miss. We do have a new melee option, and you can slot new melee weapons that are essentially their own class of gun. But you have your typical guns. You have auto rifles, SMGs, pistols, which are sometimes burst pistols, automatic pistols, or crossbows, shotguns, and launchers. That's pretty much it. There's no laser guns in this game, and the guns are designed to fit that bunkers and badass aesthetic. For example, all of the manufacturers have had their names changed, so it's not Hyperion, it's Hyperius. Black Powder, which I assume is the Jacobs of this world. Is it Scav? No, it's not Scav, because Scav and Bandit were in previous games, but it's like Buccaneer, or something weird like that. There are your traditional manufacturers. You have TDR, you have Torg, you have Vladoff, even if they have different names, and they do the same things essentially. The gunplay does take all of its inspiration pretty much from Borderlands 2, where you have guns that do multiple things. So for example, I had a Vladoff auto rifle. You hit down on the D-pad, the auto rifle barrel twists, and now it's a shotgun. That kind of stuff. There's sniper rifles too. And the elements are pretty much the same. You have fire, you have acid, you have electricity. The new element, there's no slag, is... What's the new element? Oh, it's... Is it like life or death magic? It's basically when you deal damage, you sap energy, you sap health from the enemies. That's all it is. And that can be very useful in certain encounters, especially if you're playing a squishier class like the Spellweaver. But your inventory is set up pretty much the same. You have your 4 gun slots. You now have a new melee slot. You have a new armor slot. Gone are the specific class relics and iridium relics. Basically, you can slot a ring, which you do unlock a second ring slot later in the game. You have a necklace slot. You have an armor slot. So this is very much D&D. This is leaning into the D&D, which is good because your armor slots give you bonuses to stats. So say in your skill tree you had a skill point in gun damage, you had a skill point in a perk that increases your reload speed, and the one next to it increased your health. You can find armor that'll put a point in each of those. And when you start to dual spec, you will find armor that dual specs for different classes. So this is really cool if you're playing with people and you're all running different dual specs. You can find armor that's for the Berserker and the Spellweaver, but you're the Spore Warden and the Stabomancer. But your buddy is the Berserker Spellweaver. So you can go, hey, is this good for you? And they'll be like, yeah, thanks, man. And they'll put the armor on and they'll run away and they'll go hit stuff with their hammer. The one thing I will say is item level is in this game. I don't know what it does. I really don't know what the item level does in this game, because at least for me, Borderlands has always been the numbers on the gun. Are there more green arrows than there are red arrows, and is there a multiplier for the element I'm using? If those aren't there, if they're all red, it's not a good gun. And sometimes that happens. You get gear that's a higher item level but the stats are worse than what you have. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't know if they explained it and I just wasn't paying attention. I don't know. So that's your gear. Rings and necklaces are basically artifacts. They're accessories like any other RPG. For the Spellweaver, you have 2 spell slots, which you'll find tomes to shoot spells. I'm going to assume that other classes also have something to put in those slots that aren't spells. I don't know. I didn't play another class. I may down the road. If we do a big retrospective one day, who knows? So that's all of the player screen, basically. That's all your combat and stuff. You'll be going around, shoot enemies. They have overshields, they have armor, match different elements to do bonus damage and to whittle down armor or overshields quicker. They do tell you early on that, They do tell you early on that ice damage is strong against undead enemies. And I'm going to be honest, the enemy type in this game gets stale pretty quick. I know Borderlands has never had a very varied enemy type, but this, I don't know, I was tired of fighting goblins and skeletons for 2/3 of the game. And then you meet the fish, the mer people. And then finally in the last zone of the overworld, that's when you get introduced to Cyclops. But that's it. And there's dragons, there's like wyverns that you can fight. I don't know. They're not bad. It's just going to be stale. You're going to be fighting the same types of enemies over and over and over again. So it's something to keep in mind. So the core gameplay is unlike Borderlands of past. It is not one big world that's connected. Although 3 was very much fly to this planet, but then that planet was a big open world that was connected by loading screens. You go through doors and stuff. But it's not like Borderlands 2 or the pre-sequel, where you kind of go from point to point to point, and it all feels connected. You have an overworld, which is set to look like a tabletop game. And this is actually one thing that I really liked about Tiny Tina's, because the tabletop game, it's meant to look like a table. There's pencils, there's popcorn kernels, there's cheese puffs. The river on the game map is a spilt over orange soda can. Bridges are made out of bottle caps. This is one of the more unique parts that I find really works and adds some extra fun to the game. It's not game-changing, it's not game-breaking, it doesn't make it Game of the Year, but it's fun. It adds to the world, to the ambience. And as you progress through the game, you'll gain abilities to unlock secrets along the map. So it's very go from point A to point B, and you walk around as this big-headed miniature. You almost look like a Funko Pop. You just, oh, it's Bright Hoof, gonna go in Bright Hoof. You go into the loading zone, you're in the town. The game does have bigger hubs, more like 3 than I would say the older games. There's a snowy mountain zone, there's an oasis, there's like a grassy zone, there's a forest zone. Out of all the zones, I think my favorite was right around probably the end of Act 2, start of Act 3. It was called Carcron's Wall or Charon's Wall. Basically, there's this point in the game where you have to go through this underwater set of zones. It's like 3 zones. That was my least favorite part. I was so bored. It just looked so stale. And I just didn't like it. It was nothing to do with the gameplay, because the gameplay was consistent. It was just aesthetically, I don't know. I didn't like the underwater zones. It's just me. So finally, you beat the underwater boss, which these are how these zones work. You do a bunch of quests. That leads you to a final boss. You kill the final boss. You either go to Bright Hoof or you unlock a new part of the overworld. So after doing that, we went to this Carcron's Wall thing. And it's this big mountainside that you're scaling. And built into the mountainside, it looks like a rib cage with a giant skull on top. And the skull's jaw is an elevator. Not only is that cool in and of itself, What I loved about this zone and why it's probably my favorite zone in the game is when you load in, you're high up in the mountains. So below you is kind of all fog, but in the distance, you can see two other zones from the overworld. So when you look in the distance, you can see the castle from Brighthoof, which is the main hub, and you also see this giant beanstalk, which is a zone that you create by doing a side quest earlier in the game. And I thought that was so cool. One of my favorite things in video games is when you progress through a game and you can see where you came from. There's a goblin mountain that's like really far to the north. I would have been cool if I could see that in the distance, but just seeing the beanstalk and the castle itself, that was the moment where I kind of settled into my chair and I said to myself, that's really cool. That's nice. I like that a lot. And some of the more jadedness of my opinions kind of melted away a little bit, and I was like, you know what? I shouldn't be expecting Borderlands 2. This is fun. I will say one of the reasons I didn't like the game is the quests. It's a lot of, and again, this is D&D, so this is probably something I'll have to get used to if I decide to play Baldur's Gate, which I might. But it was also one of the problems I had with Final Fantasy 16 and Hogwarts Legacy. A lot of it was fetch questing. There are some side quests that are really fun. There's one in the Oasis where you help this Cyclops find this ancient Cyclops relic that makes him the king of the clans almost. That was really unique. There are also probably about 4 major side quest chains, and those take place across the major zones of the game. So one of them was helping start a Goblin Rebellion. One of them was a Witcher 3 reference, which I thought was really fun. There's one that takes place across 2 zones where you help these undead pirates. And the last one, it might have been a Claptrap quest chain. I can't remember because it was very early on. We're talking, if I spent 60 hours in Tiny Tina's, 25 hours before I played Final Fantasy 16, which was another 60-hour game. But the moment-to-moment gameplay, it's very good. It's Borderlands. The gunplay feels good. The enemies can feel a little damage spongy. I don't know if my gear was just too underleveled or what, but that's something to be aware of. And when you're playing solo, it can get a little tiresome just emptying mag into normal enemies. But overall, the art direction was good. The aesthetics were nice. It was pleasant to look at. It was very bright and colorful. The only zones I didn't like were the underwater zones. The writing isn't as good as Borderlands 2, and I think this has been a complaint with the franchise since 2, maybe even the pre-sequel. I know a lot of people, including myself, were not fans of the writing in 3. This kind of has very similar writing, although this is definitely more for younger audiences than the other games. To the point where I was honestly surprised, and this could have been a pandemic thing, they're the only returning characters besides Queen Lady Butt Stallion, which I don't know what they did to her model in this game, but she looks like she's being choked and her eyes are just bugging out. It was a little weird and unsettling to look at. But besides her, the only cameos from older characters was Brick shows up, Torg shows up, Claptrap shows up, and the one I mentioned early in the video when you get to the end of the game. But that's really it. So basically you just go from zone to zone, do some quests, unlock the next zone, fight the boss, go there, and that's it. And eventually you'll get to the top of the crypt where you fight the Dragon Lord. And I guess this is the only part of the game where you're given a choice. I will not say what that choice is in case you do decide to play it. But you deal with the Dragon Lord, you collect all your loot, you go back to Brighthoof, you become the savior of the realm, and then you unlock the arena. This was something that 3 did, where you had the arenas more towards the end of the game, like the Torg arenas and stuff, and those were where you get your legendaries and your exotics, so to speak, or I forget what they're called in Borderlands. Your purples and your oranges, right? So this is called the Chaos Chamber. And basically you go in, you complete waves of enemies, and then you're given a choice between a buff or a debuff. And the buffs range, or the debuffs I should say, range in difficulty, some making them harder than others. And you do this long gauntlet, and then at the end of each encounter you collect these pearls, which you can spend on upgrades during your run. Finally, when you get to the end, you have all these pearls, and you can basically focus target gear. You dump them all into a statue, and they'll spit out gear. One thing I will say about this game compared to the others, and I don't know if it's because there was just a lot in Borderlands 3, I barely had any legendaries, which I think orange is legendary, so we're going to call that legendary. We're going to talk in World of Warcraft speak. I basically had barely any legendaries by the end of the game. Whereas opposed to a game like Borderlands 2 and 3, you know, especially 3, your kit's almost entirely orange by the time you get to the end of the game. This one is a little skimp. There are things you can do to kind of increase your chances. There are 12-sided dice, or I guess 20-sided dice scattered amongst the world, which you can smash. They'll spit out money and loot, and they'll raise your luck rating, which I think influences the drop rate of legendary gear. You can also put points. You get, when you hit max rank, your hero level, or whatever it's called, you put points into that. There's a node for luck rating to increase it. But you can refight bosses. I should mention that. Like previous games, you can refight bosses, and they have a chance to drop legendary gear and the like. But yeah, I was kind of let down by the gear. That's really it. It's there are a lot of cosmetics to get, but not all of them are nice or unique or cool to look at. A lot of it is just color swaps. The gear, some of the gear is really cool. Some of it's kind of mid. And then there are a handful of collectibles you can get. Lore scrolls and lore marbles, and that's really it. Overall, does Tiny Tina's miss the mark? I think in some aspects it does. It's not a terrible game by any means. I need to say that. It's a fun game. And I think this game is one of those games where it's more fun with friends. The Borderlands franchise has always been more fun with friends, but it's also been really good standalone on its own. Tiny Tina's was just okay on its own. And some of you may disagree because you're more of a fan of that Dungeons and Dragons aesthetic, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Just for me personally, it left me wanting more. To the point where as soon as I finished the epilogue, I uninstalled the game. Because I knew I wasn't going to be going back to it for a long time. I definitely think there are things here that are fun, that work. I definitely think they could have done a bit better on things like gear and character customization, and I definitely think the world zone, or the zones in the world, could have used a little more love and a little care, because a lot of them are kind of barren, and you're just like walking around. Another thing is the enemies respawn like crazy. I don't know why. They just do. Maybe it's because once you get into a zone, you're not really loading into another zone. It's all just one continuous zone, so they're on timers or invisible lines that you cross that cause them to respawn. I don't know. All in all, good game. Not great. Could be better. Tends to be a theme with Borderlands these days. Should you play it? If you want. I would wait for a sale. Other than that, that's all I have to say on this game. So thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, do all the things YouTubers tell you. Let me know down below what your thoughts on Tiny Tina's Wonderlands were. And I'm going to go pick a game to review next. I got a lot of games over there, so let me get to it. Otherwise, have a great weekend, and I'll see you next time.